This program is presented and distributed by Keep the Faith on the web at www.keepthefaith.org.
This second talk I'm giving this one is called the Liturgical Revolution. I want to begin it by saying a little about the Mass. And the Mass is at the centre of Catholic life, just as Christ is the central figure in the Christian religion. As well as being a sacrifice, it is the greatest of all the sacraments as it contains Christ himself. It not only symbolises or represents the passion and death of Christ, but contains it. The Mass is the sacrifice of the cross, a fact which St. Thomas Aquinas illustrates by quoting St. Ambrose. In Christ was offered up a sacrifice capable of giving eternal salvation. What then do we do? Do we not offer it up every day in memory of his death? It would be impossible to write anything that could exaggerate the importance of the Mass. It is at the centre of the Christian life, just as Christ is a central figure in the Christian religion. The pontificate of St. Gregory the Great is the crucial epoch in the history of the Roman Mass. He became Pope in 590 and reigned until 604. His achievements during those 14 years almost defy credibility, and prominent among the many important reforms that he undertook was that of the liturgy, which in every important respect was left in the state that is found in the Missal of 1570. The keynote of his reform was fidelity to the traditions that had been handed down. The root meaning of the Latin word traditio is to hand over or hand down. The order of Mass that we'll be taking part in up in the church a little later is very, very close to what's found in the Missal of St. Gregory the Great. And from the early Middle Ages onwards, there's very little to chronicle about change in the order of Mass itself. The Mass, as we have it today, was regarded as a sacred and inviolable inheritance, and its origins were forgotten in the mists of times. The 16th century Protestant reformers broke with the tradition of the Church by the very fact of initiating a drastic reform of liturgical rites. And this would have been the case even if their liturgies had been orthodox. The nature of their heresy was made clear not so much by what their rites contained as by what they omitted from the traditional books. In 1898, the Anglican bishops of England published a defence of the liturgical reform initiated by Thomas Cranmer and the other English reformers, and the English bishops claimed that all Cranmer had done was to try and return to primitive usage. The Catholic bishops responded in very, very vigorous language, and they denied the right of national or local churches to devise their own rites. This is what the Catholic bishops said. They must not omit or reform anything in those forms which immemorial tradition has bequeathed to us. For such an immemorial usage, whether or not it has in the course of ages incorporated superfluous accretions, must, in the estimation of those who believe in a divinely guarded visible church, at least have retained whatever is necessary, so that, in adhering rigidly to the rite handed down to us, we can always feel secure, whereas, if we omit or change anything, we may perhaps be abandoning just that element which is essential. And this sound method is that which the Catholic Church has always followed. That in earlier times local churches were permitted to add new prayers and ceremonies is acknowledged, but that they were also permitted to subtract prayers and ceremonies in previous use, and even to remodel the existing rites in the most drastic manner, is a proposition for which we know of no historical foundations, and which appears to us absolutely incredible. Hence, Cranmer, in taking this unprecedented course, acted, in our opinion, with the most inconceivable rashness. The Missal of Pope St. Pius V was compiled and published in 1570 in obedience to the Fathers of the Council of Trent and as a response to the liturgical revolution initiated by the Protestant reformers. In its 18th session, the Council had appointed a commission to examine the Missal, to revise it and restore it according to the custom and rite of the Holy Fathers. Father Fortescue makes particular mention of the liturgical continuity which characterised the new Missal. The Missal of St. Pius V was not simply a personal decree of the sovereign pontiff, but an act of the Council of Trent, even though the council closed on the 4th of December 1563, before the commission had completed its task. The matter was remitted to Pope Pius IV, but he died before the work was concluded, so that it was his successor, St. Pius V, who promulgated the missal resulting from the council with the bull Quo Primum Tempore, the 14th of July 1570. This was the first time during the entire 1,570 years of the Church's history that a council or a pope had actually used written legislation to specify and impose a complete rite of Mass. It would be impossible to lay too much stress upon the fact that St. Pius V did not promulgate a new order of Mass, a Novus Ordo Missae. The keynote of his reform, like that of St. Gregory, was fidelity to tradition. The Catholic instinct has been to hold fast to what has been handed down and to look upon any novelty with the utmost suspicion. The beauty, the worth, the perfection of the Roman liturgy of the Mass, so universally acknowledged and admired, was described by Father Frederick Faber as the most beautiful thing this side of heaven. He continues, "It came forth out of the grand mind of the Church, and lifted us out of earth and out of self, and wrapped us round in a cloud of mystical sweetness, and the sublimities of a more than angelic liturgy, and purified us almost without ourselves, and charmed us with celestial charming, so that our very senses seemed to find vision, hearing, fragrance, taste and touch beyond what earth can give." After the reform of St. Pius V, just as had been the case before it, the Mass of the Roman Rite was regarded as a sacred trust to be handed on to each new generation, just as it had been received. The bull Quo Primum, contrary to what some traditional Catholics think, did not preclude any revision or any reform of the Roman Rite. St. Pius X reformed the Gregorian notation. Pope Pius XII reformed the Holy Week ceremonies. But that the idea that the entire Mass could be subjected to a radical reform was considered absolutely inconceivable up to and during the Second Vatican Council. And I'm going to show you later that the reform enacted in the name of Vatican II was in no way mandated by Vatican II. If we are to understand the liturgical revolution that followed the Second Vatican Council, we must go back to the year 1912, to the little town of Civitella di Lego, obviously in Italy, where a son was born to the Bunini family, and he was named Annibale. From an early age, he evinced an interest in the priesthood. He studied theology in the Congregation of the Missions, that's the Vincentians, and in 1928 he was ordained in this order. For 10 years he did parish work in a Roman suburb, and then from 1947 to 1957 he worked in editing the missionary publications of his order. And in 1947 he began to be actively involved in the field of specialized liturgical studies. And he was appointed secretary to Pope Pius XII's Commission for Liturgical Reform in 1948, also professor of liturgy in the Pontifical Propaganda Fidei University, a consultant of the Sacred Congregation of Rites, and professor of sacred liturgy in the Lateran University. Then, in 1960, Father Bunini was placed in a position which would enable him to exert a disastrous influence upon the history of the Church. He was appointed secretary to the Preparatory Commission for the Liturgy of the Second Vatican Council. Bunini was the moving spirit behind the drafting of the preparatory schema on the liturgy, the draft document which was to be placed before the Council Fathers for discussion. Carlo Falcone, an ex-priest who's also left the Church but keeps in close contact with all his friends in the Vatican, refers to this preparatory schema as the Bunini draft. It is of the greatest possible importance to bear in mind the fact that, as was stressed in his own journal Notizie, the liturgy constitution which the Council Fathers eventually passed was substantially identical with the draft schema which Bunini had steered through the Preparatory Commission. Although his schema was accepted by a plenary session of the Liturgical Preparatory Commission in a vote taken on the 13th of January 1962, the president of the commission, the 80-year-old Cardinal Gaetano Cicognani, probably pronounced that incorrectly, had the foresight to realize the dangers implicit in certain passages. The program of reform was so vast that it caused the cardinal to hesitate, and unless he could be persuaded to sign the schema, it would be blocked. Father Bunini needed to act. He arranged for immediate approaches to be made to Pope John, who agreed to intervene. he called Cardinal Amleto Cicognani, his Secretary of State and the younger brother of Cardinal Caetano, and told him to visit his brother and not leave him until the schema had been signed. The Cardinal complied. A peritus of the Liturgical Preparatory Commission later remarked, the old Cardinal was almost in tears. He waved the document in the air and said, "They want me to sign this, but I don't know if I want to." Then he laid the document on his desk, picked up a pen and signed a death warrant for the traditional Mass of the Roman Rite, the most beautiful thing this side of heaven. 4 days later, the old Cardinal died. The Bugnini schema had been saved, and only just in time, because with the approval of Pope John, and to the outrage of liberal Catholics throughout the world, Father Bugnini was mysteriously dismissed from his chair at the Lateran University and from the secretariatship of the Liturgical Preparatory Commission. The reasons which prompted Pope John to take this step have never been divulged, but they must have been of a very, very serious nature to make this rather tolerant pontiff act in so public and drastic a manner against a priest who had occupied so prominent and influential a position in the preparation for the council. In his book, Pope John and his Council, Carlo Falcone condemns the dismissal of Father Bugnini as a retrograde step, but adds with satisfaction, all the same, Bugnini managed to get his draft through as far as the council, and now it will be interesting to see if it is passed, and even more so if the draft schema of the prescribed secretary of the Liturgical Commission should open the way for the success of other drafts of a progressive character. It was, and it did. The dismissal of Father Bugnini was very much a case of locking the stable door after the horse had bolted. He had taken it for granted that he would be appointed as secretary to the Conciliar Liturgical Commission so that he could guide his schema through the council. But this was not essential as long as it received the approval of the council fathers without any radical modifications, and he had drafted it in a manner which he was sure would do this. As I explained in my first lecture, Pope John had the first 7 preparatory schemas sent to the council fathers around the world prior to the opening of the session, but in response to an intervention by Father Skilabix, only the Bugnini scheme was found acceptable for discussion. Skilabix enthused, it was, he said, an admirable piece of work. I mentioned earlier that Bugnini had drafted his schema in a manner which he was sure would make it acceptable to the council fathers, even to the most conservative among them, and his confidence was more than justified. Cardinal Heenan cites the Liturgy Constitution, or the schema for it, as an example of a text which was open to an interpretation very different from that intended by the fathers who endorsed it by an almost unanimous vote. This is what Cardinal Heenan wrote. I'd like you to listen to this very, very carefully. At the close of the first session, little had been decided, but many ideas had been ventilated. The subject most fully debated was liturgical reform. It might be more accurate to say that the bishops were under the impression that the liturgy had been fully discussed. In retrospect, it is clear that they were given the opportunity of discussing only general principles. Now listen to this. Subsequent changes were more radical than those intended by Pope John and the bishops who passed the decree on the liturgy. His sermon at the end of the first session shows that Pope John did not suspect what was being planned by the liturgical experts. Well, this statement is completely unambiguous. It was made by one of the most active and erudite council fathers, and he tells us that Father Bugnini and some of his fellow periti had engaged in a conspiracy to deceive Pope John and the council. If we examine the finalized version of the Bugnini schema voted for almost unanimously as Sacrosanctum Concilium, the liturgy constitution of the council, it's not hard to see why it was understood, why it was acceptable even to traditional bishops. By no possible stretch of the imagination would these bishops have believed that the Constitution could be interpreted as mandating or sanctioning the destruction of the Roman Rite and the sanctuaries in which it was celebrated. It contains stipulations which appear to make any drastic remodeling of the traditional Mass impossible. The Latin language was to be preserved in the Latin rites, Article 36. Steps would be taken so that the faithful could sing or say together Latin in those parts of the Mass that pertain to them, Article 54. All lawfully acknowledged rights were held to be of equal authority and dignity, were to be preserved in the future and fostered in every way. Article 4. The treasury of sacred music was to be preserved and fostered with great care. Article 114. Gregorian chant was to be given pride of place in liturgical services. There were to be no innovations unless the good of the church genuinely and certainly required them. And care was to be taken that any new forms adopted should grow in some way organically from forms already existing. But, following what I said, Professor Coleman said in my last talk, every statement that seems to make one point of view is opposed by one giving another. It also said that where necessary, the rites be thoroughly revised in the light of sound tradition, and that they be given new vigour to meet the circumstances and needs of modern times. It also said in the restoration of the promotion of the sacred liturgy, the full and active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered before else. It said the rites should be distinguished by noble simplicity. They should be short, clear, and unencumbered by useless repetitions. They should be within the people's power of comprehension and normally not require much explanation. I cited Article 36, requiring that the Latin language be preserved in the Latin rites. But the same article gave permission for the use of the vernacular in the Mass and the sacraments to be extended. Reference was made to the readings, some of the prayers and chants. The idea that the whole Mass would ever be said in the vernacular didn't occur to anyone there. Cardinal Montini made an intervention. He said it was absolutely unthinkable that the canon should ever be recited in anything except the sacred language of Latin. Then he allowed 4 new canons of the Mass, and the Roman canon all be said in the vernacular. You see, a careful reading of Article 36 will show you the Second Vatican Council does not order that one word of the Mass should ever be said in the vernacular. But carry on with a careful reading, and you see it doesn't exclude any part of the Mass, which is quite a time bomb. Then, here are some terrible parts. Provided that the substantial unity of the Roman Rite is maintained, the revision of the liturgical book should allow for legitimate variations and adaptations to different groups, regions and peoples, especially in the mission lands. Now, nobody explains what on earth this is meant. And then it goes on to say, in some places, an even more radical adaptation of the liturgy is needed. So it's not said what a radical adaptation is, but it says you might need an even more radical adaptation. And all this, you see, has to be done by the commissions that will be set up after the council. They're the people who are going to interpret this. Now, confining our... I'll just read you one more. And this is, you can see, this could be a mandate to change the whole Mass and destroy it. The rite of Mass is to be revised in such a way that the intrinsic nature and purpose of its several parts, as also the connection between them, can be more clearly manifested, and that devout and active participation by the congregation can be more easily accomplished. For this purpose, the rites are to be simplified, while due care is taken to preserve their substance. Elements which, with the passage of time, came to be duplicated or were added with little advantage are now to be discarded. I'll just repeat that last sentence again. Elements which, with the passage of time, came to be duplicated or were added with little advantage are now to be discarded. Confining ourselves to the ordinary of the Mass, that's the part that stays the same every day, we must ask whether in fact there are any parts which with the passage of time came to be duplicated or were added with very little advantage. And I would insist that no such parts exist. The survival of the virtually unchanged 1570 Missal until 1965 was, even from a cultural standpoint, something of a miracle. It would not be an exaggeration to describe this Missal as the most sublime product of Western civilization, more perfect in its balance, rich in its imagery, inspiring, consoling and instructive than even the most beautiful cathedral in Europe. It should not be a matter of surprise that when Pius V finally codified the Roman rite of Mass, he enshrined the jewel of our faith in a setting of more than human perfection, a mystic veil worthy of the divine mystery which it enveloped. Nicholas Wiseman was appointed as the first English cardinal and the first Archbishop of Westminster following the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy in England and Wales by Blessed Pius IX in 1850. This great pastor and scholar wrote concerning the Mass that he celebrated each day of his priestly life, and I'm quoting Cardinal Wiseman now. If we examine each prayer separately, it is perfect. Perfect in construction, perfect in thought, and perfect in expression. If we consider the manner in which they are brought together, we are struck with the brevity of each, with the sudden but beautiful transitions, and the almost stanza-like effect with which they succeed one another, forming a lyrical composition of surpassing beauty. If we take the entire service as a whole, it is constructed with the most admirable symmetry, proportioned in its parts with perfect judgment, and so exquisitely arranged as to excite and preserve an unbroken interest in the sacred action. No doubt, to give full force and value to this sacred rite, its entire ceremonial is to be considered. The assistants with their noble vestments, the chant, the incense, the more varied ceremonies which belong to a solemn mass are all calculated to increase veneration and admiration. But still, the essential beauties remain whether the holy rite be performed under the golden vault of St. Peter's or in a wretched wigwam erected in haste by some poor savages for their missionary. I could cite such passages indefinitely, but if, as Cardinal Wiseman expressed it, if a liturgical rite is perfect in construction, perfect in thought, and perfect in expression, it's hard to understand how it contains parts that are added with little advantage. Article 23, which I already quoted you, states that there are to be no innovations unless the good of the Church genuinely and certainly require them. So I think during our daily Mass here at the Symposium, I wonder if anyone has noticed one prayer or one ceremony that you could say the good of the Church genuinely and certainly required should be abolished. Take, for example, the signs of the cross in the canon of the Mass. There are 26 signs of the cross in the canon in the 1962 Missal and only 2 in the 1970 Missal. I don't know if it's simply a coincidence that Thomas Cranmer reduced the signs of the cross from 26 to 2 in his 1549 communion service. Now it can be added, quite correctly, that the validity of the Mass doesn't require a single sign of the cross to be made in the canon or anywhere else in the Mass if it comes to that. But the question is, if we're going to obey the Council, did the good of the Church genuinely and certainly require that these signs of the cross should be abolished? If Father Barrero decided not to make all these signs today, and they have all been abolished but for 2 in the Roman canon, in the new Mass, well, if he just said, well, I'll go along with that, he just made 2 signs of the cross, would your participation in the Mass be intensified? Would you become more fervent Catholics? Would you become imbued with a superabundance of supernatural charity? And the same question can be asked of every other change made to the 1962 Missal. How on earth can it be said that the good of the Church required the abolition of the Eudicame, the Sublime Offertory prayers, the Last Gospel? You remember the Council required that any innovations had to grow out of already parts of the Mass already existing. Well, these prayers we have in the offertory now, they're a Jewish form of grace. They don't grow out of anything that existed in the Catholic liturgy. All this stuff about the fruit of human hands. So in my opinion, there is not one prayer, not one gesture, not one sign of the cross in the Mass celebrated here each day by Father Barrero that could by any stretch of the imagination be said to be required to be abolished for the good of the Church. And if I'm correct, the Missal of 1970 must be seen as a massive and calculated act of defiance of the liturgy constitution of the Second Vatican Council. Then how and why were these changes imposed upon us? And the answer, of course, was given by Cardinal Heenan during the debate on the Pastoral Constitution Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope. Goodness me, we haven't had much joy and hope since the Council. And he warned the Fathers to scrutinise the text with great care before voting on them because of the danger that, and I've quoted this before, the mind of the Council will have to be interpreted to the world by the periti who helped the Fathers of the Commission to draw up the documents. God forbid that this should happen. I fear periti when they are left to explain what the bishops meant. It is of no avail to talk about a college of bishops if periti in articles, books and speeches contradict and pour scorn on what the body of bishops teaches. Well, what Cardinal Heenan feared would happen, happened. The confidence of the Liberals that they would dominate the post-conciliar commissions was more than justified. On the 5th of March 1964, the Osservatore Romano announced the establishment of the Commission for the Implementation of the Constitution on the Liturgy. It became known as the Concilium. It just means a committee. The initial membership, and I'm quoting from the Osservatore Romano, the initial membership consisted of members of the Bunini Commission, which had drafted the Constitution, and believe it or not, and this I find absolutely astonishing, Pope Paul VI appointed Bunini as Secretary of the Post-Conciliar Commission on the 29th of February 1964. He was thus placed in a position to interpret the document that he had drafted with the intention of deceiving the popes and the bishops in the way he intended to develop it. And I just find it quite unbelievable how a man who had been dismissed by Pope John the 23rd, which must have been very, very serious, the reasons to remove him from the secretaryship of the Preparatory Commission, to remove him from the Lateran University, how John the 23rd's successor could reappoint him to that very position. It's a great mystery. In theory, Bunini's concilium was an advisory body, and the reforms it devised had to be implemented by the Sacred Congregation for Rites, or the Sacred Congregation for the Discipline of the Sacraments. And Father Bunini's power was increased when he was appointed Under Secretary to the Sacred Congregation of Rites. And on the 8th of May 1969, Pope Paul promulgated the Apostolic Constitution, Sacra Rituum Congregatio, which ended the existence of Bunini's concilium as a separate body by incorporating it into the Congregation for Divine Worship as a special commission which would retain its members and consultors and remain until the reform of the liturgy had been committed. And who do you think was appointed to be the all-powerful secretary of this congregation? None other than Father Annibale Bunini. And it's certainly no exaggeration to claim that what had happened in effect was that his concilium, his committee, in other words Father Bunini himself, had taken over the Sacred Congregation for Divine Worship, so that the great architect of the revolution was now able to consolidate and extend the revolution behind which he had been the moving spirit and principle of continuity. Nominal heads of commissions, congregations, and the concilium came and went. Cardinal Lecaro, Cardinal Gut, Cardinal Tabera, Cardinal Knox, but Father Bunini always remained, and his services were rewarded by elevating him to the rank of titular Archbishop of Diocletiana on the 7th of January 1972. Cardinal Heenan remarked bitterly, "There is a certain poetic justice in the humiliation of the Catholic Church at the hands of the liturgical anarchists. Catholics used to laugh at Anglicans for being high or low. The old boast that the Mass is everywhere the same and that Catholics are happy whichever priest celebrates is no longer true. When on the 7th of December 1962 the bishops voted overwhelmingly in favour of the first chapter of the Constitution on the liturgy, they did not know that they were initiating a process which, after the council, would cause confusion and bitterness throughout the Church. Confusion and bitterness, these are the fruits of the practical implementation of the Liturgy Constitution, which no Catholic who loves the Church, who loves the Mass, who loves the faith of his fathers has been able to escape." The 7th of December 1962 is one of the blackest days in the history of the Church. Had any council father been told how Mass would be celebrated in a typical parish today, his reaction would almost certainly have been that of Archbishop R.J. Dwyer of Portland, Oregon, who commented on that fateful day with the benefit of hindsight in 1973, "Who dreamed on that day," that's the day they voted for the Liturgy Constitution, "who dreamed on that day that within a few years, far less than a decade, the Latin past of the Church would be all but expunged, that it would be reduced to a memory fading in the middle distance. The thought of it would have horrified us, but it seemed so far beyond the realm of possibility as to be ridiculous, so we laughed it off." Thus, when certain conciliar texts are interpreted in a manner which appears to be in direct conflict with Catholic teaching and tradition, the natural reaction is to exclaim, "But could that possibly have been intended?" And as far as the intention of the majority of Council Fathers is concerned, such a judgment would certainly be true. But, to quote Archbishop Dwyer again, "The great mistake of the Council Fathers was to allow the implementation of the Constitution on the sacred liturgy to fall into the hands of men who are either unscrupulous or incompetent. This is the so-called liturgical establishment, a sacred cow which acts more like a white elephant as it tramples on the shards of a shattered liturgy with ponderous abandon." The great mistake of the Council Fathers was, in fact, voting for the Constitution with virtual unanimity. Only 4 bishops voted against it. But as Cardinal Heenan explained, they did not suspect what the liturgical experts were planning. Once the bishops had returned to their diocese and Bugnini and his gang obtained total control over the liturgy of the Roman Rite, whatever they had mandated was certain to receive papal approbation and to be implemented automatically by the church bureaucracy throughout the world. I know that Dietrich von Hildebrand has pointed out in his book The Trojan Horse and the City of God this unfortunate mentality where people just think of themselves as being, say, in a political bureaucracy. Someone higher than you says do this, so you just do it. And I mentioned, I'm not going to start going too much about Freemasons, but in the document of the Alta Vendita, they said the Catholic Church is the organisation in the world best suited to be destroyed by a revolution if it comes from above. So, to the best of my knowledge, the only prelate in the entire world who made any attempt to preserve the traditional Mass was in fact Cardinal Heenan, who persuaded the Pope to allow it to continue to be celebrated on a limited basis in England and Wales, as it was the Mass used by the martyrs of these countries and the people had a great devotion to it. Bugnini made no secret of his anger at this concession. So actually, there's never been a time when the traditional Mass wasn't celebrated with official approval, thanks to that. On the 3rd of April 1969, another black day in the history of the Church, Pope Paul VI announced in his apostolic constitution, Missale Romanum, that the missal promulgated in 1570 by his illustrious predecessor, St. Pius V, was to be replaced by one promulgated on his own authority. Pope Paul VI actually believed that he could improve upon the perfection of the Missal of St. Pius V. And he broke, and this is very important, he broke with the invariable tradition of all his predecessors to do something hitherto unknown in the history of the Church in the East or in the West. With the single exception of the Protestant Reformation, he authorized a remodeling of the existing rites in the most drastic manner, including the composition of a new order of Mass, a Novus Ordo Missae. It's claimed that all this was done in obedience to the Second Vatican Council. Today's all-powerful liturgical bureaucrats expect us to be taken in by the oldest and most evident non sequitur of all, post hoc ergo propter hoc. Because a change followed the Council, it must have been mandated by the Council. Thus, in the United States, of a beautiful sanctuary built in the last century through the devotion and sacrifices of poor immigrants is vandalized by liturgical barbarians, and the descendants of those immigrants have the temerity to ask whether the destruction was absolutely necessary. They are denounced as opponents of the Council and cast into the outer darkness. Far from preserving and fostering the Roman Rite as the Council required, it has been destroyed, and the treasury of sacred music, Gregorian chant in particular, has been all but forgotten in the majority of parishes. Young people throughout the world are being drawn in millions to the sublime beauty of Gregorian chant, but alas, they find it in record shops, not in Catholic churches. There's not a single word in a single council document which even hints at the possibility of completely vernacular masses, mass facing the people, tearing tabernacles from the high altar, smashing sanctuary rails, smashing altars and replacing them with tables, standing for communion, communion in the hand, communion under both kinds on Sundays, extraordinary ministers of communion, altar girls, inclusive language, clown masses, dancing girls, let alone dancing boys in pink leotards, which happened at a mass in Chicago, banjos, balloons. What have these practices possibly got to do with the making present of the sacrifice of Calvary? The passion of the Lord is the sacrifice we offer, wrote St. Cyprian. Would the bishops who allow these practices, if they'd been present at Calvary when our Lord was dying on the cross, would they have united themselves with his passion by allowing clowns to perform or bringing on dancing girls? As I've already explained, the new order of Mass, the Novus Ordo Missae, concocted by Father Bugnini's concilium, was not so much envisaged, let alone mandated by the fathers of the Second Vatican Council, who would most certainly not have voted for it as it stands to say. And you don't have to take my word for this. I want to quote a man who's possibly the greatest liturgist of the second half of this century, the late Monsignor Klaus Gamba. And if you haven't read his book, The Reform of the Roman Liturgy, you ought to get it. He was described by Cardinal Ratzinger as the one scholar who among the army of pseudo-liturgists truly represents the liturgical thinking at the centre of the Church. And as regards the attitude the Council Fathers would have taken to the changes that have been foisted upon us, he writes, one statement we can make with certainty is that the new order of Mass that has now emerged would not have been endorsed by the majority of the Council Fathers. Monsignor Gamba insists correctly that what we have experienced is not a renewal, but a debacle that worsens with each passing year. I'll quote him again. The liturgical reform, welcomed with so much idealism and hope by so many priests and lay people alike, has turned out to be a liturgical destruction of startling proportions, a debacle worsening with each passing year. Instead of the hoped-for renewal of the Church and of Catholic life, we are now witnessing a dismantling of the traditional values and piety on which our faith rests. Instead of the fruitful renewal of the liturgy, what we see is the destruction of the forms of the Mass which had developed organically during the course of many centuries. And I think this great liturgist, he wasn't exaggerating when he used the word destruction. And this can be made clear by citing the opinion of someone from the opposite end of the theological or liturgical spectrum, Father Joseph Gallinau, a French priest. Some of you might even remember the Gallinau Psalms when they were introduced. He was described by Archbishop Bugnini as one of the great masters of the international liturgical world, which of course means he agreed with Archbishop Bugnini. And Gallinau was one of the most influential members of the Concilium, and he wrote a book called Demain la Liturgie, the Liturgy of Tomorrow. And he commented really with commendable honesty, but not the least sign of regret. This is what he says. Let those who, like myself, have known and sung a Latin Gregorian High Mass remember it if they can. Let them compare it with the Mass that we now have. Not only the words, the melodies, and some of the gestures are different. To tell the truth, it is a different liturgy of the Mass. This needs to be said without ambiguity. The Roman Rite, as we knew it, no longer exists. Le rite romain tel que nous l'avons connu n'existe plus. It has been destroyed. Il est détruit. So the Council commanded that all lawfully acknowledged rites were to be preserved in the future and fostered in every way. Father Gallinau testifies, and who is better qualified to do so, that the Roman rite has been destroyed. And how you preserve and foster a rite by destroying it is something that even Archbishop Bugnini might have found hard to explain. Father Gallinau has also testified to the fact that the liturgical revolution which followed the Council went far beyond what the Council Fathers intended, and his testimony must surely be conclusive. He writes, it would be false to identify this liturgical renewal with the reform of rites decided on by Vatican II. This reform goes back much further and goes forward far beyond the conciliar prescriptions. Elle va bien au-delà. The liturgy, this is his verdict on the liturgy we now have. The liturgy is a permanent workshop. La liturgie est un chantier permanent. By 1974, Bugnini was able to boast that his liturgical reform had been a major conquest of the Catholic Church. Then, at the very moment when his power had reached its zenith, Archbishop Bugnini was summarily dismissed to the dismay of liberal Catholics throughout the world. It was not simply that the Archbishop had been dismissed, his entire congregation was dissolved and merged with the Congregation for the Sacraments under the terms of Pope Paul's Apostolic Constitution Constans Nobis, published in the Zorite Romano English edition on the 31st of July 1975. The name Bugnini did not appear in any of the appointments to this new congregation, and liberals throughout the entire world were dismayed. A journalist you might have heard of, Desmond O'Grady, who writes for the Tablet in Europe, the National Catholic Report in the United States. This is what he said in his column, which appeared in a lot of papers. Archbishop Annibale Bugnini, who is secretary of the abolished Congregation for Divine Worship, was the key figure in the Church's liturgical reform and is not a member of the new congregation. Nor, despite his lengthy experience, was he consulted in the planning of it. The abrupt way in which this was done does not augur well for the Bugnini line of encouragement for reform in collaboration with local authorities. Monsignor Bugnini conceived the next 10 years' work as concerned principally with the incorporation of local usages into the liturgy. He represented the continuity of the post-conciliar reform. And I've no time to go into it now, but in some countries like India, the ordinary faith were in despair. It hasn't been Indianized, the Mass, it's been Hinduized. And it's hard to tell the difference between some Masses and the rites of the Hindu religion. L'Osservatore Romano carried the following announcement in its English edition on the 15th of January 1976. The Holy Father has appointed Apostolic Pronuncio in Iran His Excellency, the Most Reverend Annibale Bugnini CM, titular Archbishop of Diocletiana. This was interpreted by his supporters and his opponents as a sentence of exile. It came as no surprise when in April 1976, Tito Cassini, who is Italy's leading Catholic writer, he publicly accused Monsignor Bugnini of being a Freemason. Then, on the 8th of October in the same year, Le Figaro published a report stating that Bugnini denied that he had ever had any Masonic affiliations. Well, I made my own investigation into this matter, and I can vouch for the authenticity of the following facts. A Roman priest of the very highest reputation, Don Luigi Villa, who lives in Brescia. I've been hoping to go and see him today, but it hasn't worked out. He's still alive and living in Brescia. He came into possession of evidence which he considered proved Monsignor Bugnini to be a Freemason. He had this information placed into the hands of Pope Paul VI by a cardinal he knew, and he warned the cardinal that if the Pope didn't take action at once, he would be bound in conscience to make the matter public. Monsignor Bugnini was immediately dismissed and his entire congregation dissolved. And in order to verify this, I got in touch with Don Villa, and I asked, would he be willing to give me the information that he'd given to the Pope so that it could be published? And I got the following reply. I've got it in my book, Pope Paul's New Mass, in the Italian as well. But he said, I regret that I am unable to comply with your request. The secret which must surround the denunciation, in consequence of which Monsignor Bugnini had to go, is top secret. And such it has to remain for many reasons. The fact that the above-mentioned Monsignore was immediately dismissed from his post is sufficient. This means that the arguments are more than convincing. Now, something I want to make very clear here. The facts that I've been able to establish do not in any way prove that Archbishop Bugnini was a Freemason. What I've been able to establish is that documentation purporting to prove that he was a Mason was placed into the hands of the Pope, who then dismissed the Archbishop and banished him to Iran. Archbishop Bugnini made a rather violent attack upon me in the May 1980 issue of the Homiletic and Pastoral Review, and he said I'm a calumniator and I have colleagues who are calumniators by profession. Well, he's probably right there, because the school I taught in, all the other teachers were women, but who tend to calumniate a bit now and then, but I don't know if that was what he meant. Anyway, he said, I'm a calumniator and I've got colleagues who are calumniators by profession. He denied that he'd ever been a Freemason, but as I've just explained, I didn't say that I could prove he was. Only that he'd been dismissed by Pope Paul VI because Pope Paul VI believed him to have been a Mason. And then the Archbishop admitted this himself in his posthumous account of the liturgical reform, which was published in Italian in 1983 and in English in 1990. On page 93 of the English edition of this book, he quoted from the letter of the homiletic in which he was condemning me as a calumniator. But he on the same page, in page 91, he concedes precisely what I'd alleged. Referring to his dismissal and the suppression of the Congregation for Divine Worship, this is Bugnini's account of it. What were the reasons that led the Pope to such a drastic decision which no one expected and which lay so heavily on the Church? I said in the preface to this book that I myself never knew any of these reasons for sure, even though understandably in the distress of the moment I knocked on many doors at all levels. Towards the end of the summer, a cardinal, who was usually no enthusiast for liturgical reform, told me of the existence of a dossier which he had seen or brought to the Pope's desk, which proved that Archbishop Bugnini was a Freemason. But in fairness to him, I'm going to say he denied that. He said that this was a conspiracy by people who wanted to undermine the credibility of his liturgical reform, which wouldn't be hard to do because I don't think it had any credibility anyway. And personally, I regret that the question of Bugnini being a Mason has ever been raised. In his book, The Devastated Vineyard, published in 1973, Dietrich von Hildebrand observed, truly, if one of the devils in C.S. Lewis's The Screw-Tape Letters had been entrusted with the ruin of the liturgy, he could not have done it better. Now, this is a statement based on an objective assessment of the reform itself. And it's beyond dispute that the Roman Rite has been destroyed, no matter whether it's been destroyed deliberately or by people who reformed it with good intentions. Even if the result of what's happened to the liturgy is simply the consequence of ill-judged decisions by well-meaning men, the objective fact remains unchanged. They could not have destroyed the Roman Rite more effectively had they done so deliberately. And the Masonic connection diverts the attention of many Catholics from this fact. They tend to think that the liturgical reform is bad because Bugnini was a Mason, but if it could be proved that he was not a Mason, then one would have to presume there's nothing to complain about. And it must also be stressed that although Archbishop Bugnini could be said to be responsible for the liturgical reform in that he was the motivating person behind it, it can't change the fact that Pope Paul VI must accept responsibility for it. He must accept what is called executive responsibility for all the official changes. Whether he liked them or not, he authorized them, and he didn't repudiate or revoke any of them. However, in addition to just authorizing them, it's clear that he was enthusiastic about these changes. If you read Bugnini's autobiography, you'll see he was in consultation with the Pope the whole time, and the Pope fully approved of everything he did. But providentially, the Pope never went to the extent of using his full authority to forbid the traditional Mass in a manner that would have been legally binding. The dismissal of Bugnini from the Liturgical Preparatory Commission of the Vatican achieved little, as I explained earlier, as it was closing the stable draft the horse had gone, as the draft had already been completed and was passed virtually unchanged. And you could say the same for his dismissal from the Congregation for Divine Worship. It achieved very little because the new Mass was already in place. His concilium, with the active help of 6 Protestant observers, transformed the rite of Mass, which St. Pius V had promulgated in perpetuity, as a barrier against the Protestant heresy, into a new order of Mass, a Novus Ordo Missae, which was far more acceptable from a Protestant standpoint, and which Cardinals Ottaviani and Bacci condemned. They said it had lowered the barriers to the Protestant heresy. While the Mass of Trent remained, there could be no hope of unity with Protestants. Almost all the prayers that had been removed by the Protestant reformers were removed by Father Bugnini, no doubt upon the advice of his Protestant collaborators. If prayers such as the prayers at the foot of the altar, the Eudicame, the Confiture, the offertory prayers, the Placet Tibi, the Last Gospel. He even removed the Roman canon, but thank God, it was reinstated on the assistance of Pope Paul VI, but simply as an option. Alice and I were talking about Paul VI in between the two lectures. You know, remember I mentioned to you how he intervened and proclaimed Our Lady as Mother of the Church. We have to see it as the influence of the Holy Spirit, that Pope Paul VI insisted that they put the Roman canon back in. So you can't actually say that in the new Missal any essential Catholic doctrines can't be found there, because they're all found in the Roman canon. But of course, again, typical Vatican II compromise, the Roman canon is practically never used. Now, Bugnini denied that the Protestant observers did anything but observe. He actually stated they never spoke. They never once spoke, he said. But I wrote to one of them, a Canon Jasper, who was an Anglican observer, and I've got a letter back from him saying there were 2 sorts of meetings for the liturgy concilium. In the mornings, they had what were called the working sessions, and they thrashed out what they were going to vote on in the afternoon. And he said in those sessions, we took a very active part and expressed all our views. So Bugnini was just lying outright. So when he denied that he was ever a Mason, one can take this into consideration. I've got in my book, Pope Paul's New Mass, I've got this letter quoted and a lot of other evidence. But the Anglican observer, Archdeacon Pauli, who I've quoted frequently, he's full of enthusiasm for the Bugnini reform, which, he says, and if Archbishop Ferrer had said this, people would have been scandalised. He said it outstripped the liturgy of Cranmer in spite of the latter's 400-year start and in its modernity. The Archdeacon states with great satisfaction that, and listen to this, it is above all this new liturgy which has changed relationships out of recognition. For the revised Roman liturgy, so far from being a cause of deception, now resembles the Anglican liturgy very closely. It has also, I find this bit quite amusing, it has also demonstrated the value under certain conditions of an authoritarian government. For instead of the pains and agonies of experiments, objections, and a multitude of parallel revisions existing at the same time, the new Roman liturgy came into existence simultaneously all over the world. So Paul VI was able to get an ecumenical pat on the back for that. But I'm very pleased to say that the Archdeacon was somewhat premature in taking satisfaction with the lack of objections to the revised liturgy. Some of you might know that the Univoce Federation was inaugurated on the 19th of December 1964, and it began objecting at that time to the mutilation of our Mass, which its members clearly saw that these mutilations were being made so they would no longer be a cause of dissension for Protestants, and it's been objecting ever since. Then in 1970, with full Vatican approval, Archbishop Lefebvre established his seminary at Ancône, which has effectively guaranteed the survival of the traditional Mass. And then on the 2nd of July 1988, Pope John Paul II promulgated his motu proprio Ecclesia Dei, in which he expressed his will to guarantee respect for the rightful aspirations. And that's interesting. Our rightful aspirations, for the rightful aspirations of those attached to the Latin liturgical tradition. Before that, we were like a bunch of quasi-Protestants or lunatics, if you like, the traditional Mass. But now it's been changed to rightful aspirations. And in order to achieve this aim, he established the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei. Many bishops have responded to this admonition in a very positive manner, and where this is the case, there are no longer any restrictions attached to the celebration of the Tridentine Mass. Hundreds of such Masses are celebrated in parish churches in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and throughout the United States. And they're scheduled private Masses, fulfilling the Sunday obligation, and any member of the faithful is welcome to attend them. But on the other hand, many bishops, in fact most bishops, one has to say, have defied the clearly expressed will of the Pope and refused to permit the traditional Mass in their dioceses. And it must be remembered that the motu proprio Ecclesia Dei was issued in conjunction with the excommunication of Archbishop Lefebvre, and its primary aim was to persuade the faithful who supported the Archbishop to stop supporting and come to these indult Masses. So the fact that most of the people who supported it haven't done this doesn't change the fact that we've got these indult Masses, mainly thanks to Archbishop Lefebvre. So whatever attitude you take to him, you should say a prayer for him every day for getting us what we've got. I'm sure the Provost of the Brompton Norwich in London, where they have a Tridentine Mass every Sunday, he said to me, everything we've got, we owe it to the Archbishop. So there can't be any doubt whatsoever that the liturgical reform has not resulted in the abundant pastoral fruits that the Council Fathers had so confidently predicted. In the United States alone, Mass attendance has collapsed from 71% in 1963 to 25% in 1993, which is a decline of 65%. If we consider this in its true perspective as a loss of souls to the Church, it means that 25 million Catholics who were assisting at Mass in the bad old days when we were supposed to have been alienated by an unintelligible Latin liturgy which meant nothing to us, choose not to assist at the vibrant, renewed and comprehensible liturgy of Archbishop Giannini. Far from filling our churches with renewed, revitalized Catholics, many of them previously lapsed but brought back to the faith by an inspiring new liturgy that they could understand, we have witnessed a catastrophic decline in Mass attendance in every Western country. It seems reasonable to ask in such countries as Holland whether anything substantially exists now that can be called Catholic. Father Louis Boyer, who I've quoted several times, the French oratorian, he assures us, he says, we're witnessing not the renewal, but the accelerating decomposition of Catholicism. And yet, according to those in authority, the liturgical reform has been a tremendous pastoral success. I'm sorry to say, once again, the most prominent among these is Pope John Paul II. He's always speaking of the abundant fruits that the reform has produced. I think it was last year the Spanish bishops made their ad limina visit to Rome, and the Pope says to them the liturgical reform has produced abundant fruits in Spain as it has throughout the world. And Mass attendance in Spain is just collapsing. The Second Vatican Council has been followed by revolutionary changes in every aspect of Catholic life, but as Father Baker, editor of the Homiletic and Pastoral Review, has expressed it, it is the liturgical revolution which touches all of us intimately and immediately. Until this revolution has been overturned, there can be no hope of a restoration of normality to the Church. The present crisis cannot be overcome without restoring the liturgy that developed and endured for 19 centuries as the liturgy that will form the basis of the Church's worship in the 21st century. And with this in mind, I'd like to conclude by quoting Monsignor Gamba again. And what Monsignor Gamba said was, "In the final analysis, this means that in the future, the traditional rite of Mass must be retained in the Roman Catholic Church as the primary liturgical form for the celebration of Mass. It must become once more the norm of our faith and the symbol of Catholic unity throughout the world, a rock of stability in a period of upheaval and never-ending change." And although this might seem like an impossible dream, it isn't. On Tuesday of this week, I was in the ceremony of the Institute of Christ the King in Bricciano. It was an indescribably beautiful rite of ordination. It took 3.5 hours, and one just can't describe the liturgy of it. It really was heavenly, as Father Faber said. And the ordinations were conferred by Cardinal Medina Estevez, who's the head of the Congregation for Divine Worship. And you can't possibly exaggerate the significance of this fact that was Bugnini's congregation, and the Bugnini, the poor man, he must be stirring in his grave, to think that the prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship would come and consecrate young priests who are going to devote their whole lives to celebrating the traditional Mass. And he said, "I came here to show you that the Vatican Curia supports the traditional Mass and the traditional priesthood." And that really cheered everyone up so much, and he got tremendous applause when he came out of the church, and he was smiling and very, very, very happy. And this is a tremendous turnaround. 4 years ago, if anyone said that the prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship would one day consecrate priests for the traditional Mass, I would have mortgaged my house and put all the money on a bet that it could never possibly happen. So, in one way, as Fred Astaire said, things are looking up. But on the other hand, what is so sad, you see, is that there's a hemorrhage in membership of the church. We're losing people by the millions. Perhaps in the United States every year, perhaps 5,000-10,000 people start coming to the traditional Mass. But the mainstream church is just vanishing. In England and Wales, within 20 years, there won't be any. There'll just be a handful of traditionalists and perhaps some charismatics. In 1965, 2.5 million people went to Mass. Less than 1 million go now, and it's going down by 50,000 a year, which means 20 years there won't be anybody. So although we can rejoice in the fact that the traditional Mass is being preserved, as Catholics, we must be, heartbroken to see that our church is vanishing. And these people, most of them aren't going into Protestant sects. They're just joining, the mainstream, so the hedonistic, materialistic life, which we see in the West today. I've got one more minute. I'm going to read you, end it on a depressing note. They had, in 1980, they had a synod of bishops to assess the effects of the reform, and their concluding remarks were that we are grateful to see, with God's help, that we have achieved all the aims. We have celebrated Vatican II wholeheartedly together as a grace of God and gift of the Spirit, Holy Spirit, from which many spiritual benefits have issued for the universal church, for particular churches, and for the people of our time. For this reason, we have decided to go forward on the same path that the Council pointed out. And I commentate in this preface to my book, Pope John's Council, that's exactly what the leaders of a bunch of lemmings could say while they were rushing off the cliff. And that is our great problem, that the leaders in our church still insist that Vatican II has been a tremendous success. And every day, in every way, things are getting better and better, which I think we'd agree is not the case. And so, when you go to Mass today, just have a look and see if there's anything you think the good of the church genuinely and you're absolutely required to be omitted. And if any of you would be kind enough to buy this book, you'll see a happy little lady out there. So thanks very much. And,